When we talk about white slave trafficking in America, let's try to put this work in historical context by answering the following question. Were there white slaves at any time in history? The answer is, yes, and there were even quite a few. It is estimated that slavery has been present since the beginning of humanity. The Egyptians had slaves, the Greeks had slaves, and the Roman Empire is famous for this. And a surprising fact, many of them had been white. The Romans had slaves from all over the empire and of many skin colors. This included whites. They were probably quite white, as they had been Gauls, Celts, Germans and Picts who came from Northern Europe or Central Europe. Several authors mention their white skin, which was considered exotic and mysterious at the time. The number of slaves decreased somewhat in the Middle Ages, as a result of the fall of the Roman Empire, but was replenished when the Muslims attempted to conquer Europe in the now Spanish areas, the Italian coasts, and Byzance, what is now Istanbul. Muslims were not allowed to take another Muslim as a slave, but that didn't count Christians and Jews, so they killed many of the Christians, but captured many white women and sold them as sex slaves around the world. North African and Arab. There are many stories about harems and the fate of those white women. Also, for hundreds of years, Muslims in Spain captured and enslaved whites and took them to North Africa, some reaching places as far away as India. This practice was continued by the Saracens and Ottomans until the 18th century, and the literature of that time is full of references to this. Let us not forget the ancient Greeks and Romans, who subjected the people they conquered and the people who were guilty of certain crimes to slavery, being their main workforce, and the basis of the leisure that their culture allowed. During the 17th century, the English deported hundreds of thousands of Irish and, to a lesser extent, Scots, to their plantations in the Caribbean and North America, as slaves. There was even, exceptionally, a film, Captain Blood, with Errol Flynn and Olivia de Havilland in 1935, about it. Of course, they were not called slaves, but rather indentured servants. As the English are, masters of euphemism. Also in the 17th century, Irish slaves were sold in present-day Guyana, and 70% of the white inhabitants of Antigua and Montserrat were Irish slaves. In Australia, indentured servitude was applied to some 162,000 convicts until 1868. When talking about the white slave market in America, it has never been a focus. For some reason we don't know, the controlled media focuses exclusively on black slavery. The impression is given that only whites are responsible for enslaving blacks and that only blacks were slaves. In fact, black people in Africa engaged in extensive slavery of their own kind. Slavery was endemic in Africa, with entire tribes being enslaved through conquest on a regular basis. When the Arab, Jewish, and white slave traders arrived on the coast of sub-Saharan Africa, they rarely if ever had to travel inland and fight or pursue their prey. They were found on the coast by Africans more than willing to sell them slaves by the thousands. In America, records show that black slaves were owned, not only by a few wealthy whites, but by free blacks and by Cherokee Indians. In some cases, these blacks and Indians even owned white slaves. White slaves were actually the property of blacks and Indians in the South to such an extent that the Virginia Assembly passed following the law of 1670. It is enacted that no black or Indian, even if baptized and enjoying his own freedom, shall be able from any purchase of Christians. Records from the time reveal that free blacks often owned black slaves themselves. In 1717, it was proposed that a qualification for election to the South Carolina Assembly should be the property of a white man. From 1609 to the early 1800s, between half and two-thirds of all white settlers came to the New World as slaves. White slaves cleared the forests, drained the swamps, built the roads, sweated in the fields and died like flies in the hellish factories. Owned as property, they had no rights or recourse to the law. Fugitive slavery laws are applied to them as well as to blacks if they must flee from their masters. Black slaves were expensive, and although sometimes cruelly used, they were not often used beyond the limits of human endurance. That would have been a waste of an expensive investment. White slaves, however, consisting of Britain's poor and unwanted surplus population, were available for almost nothing, just a few pence for a thug who took them on board a ship that was headed west. Therefore, they were expendable. Both psychological and material whites of modern times are called upon to bear burdens of guilt and monetary reparation for black slavery. This position is based entirely on forced ignorance and the deliberate suppression of the record of white slavery in North America. Some people have the belief that welfare and affirmative action is compensation for past slavery. Leaving aside for the moment the very questionable idea of punishing the great-grandson for the sins of the great-grandfather, let us consider the principles involved. Much more white people in America are descendants of white slaves than they are descendants of slave owners. And considering the endemic nature of slavery in Black Africa, it is quite likely that a large proportion of blacks in America have ancestors who were slave owners themselves. So let's hear no more of white guilt and endless payments and affirmative action to atone for the sin of black slavery. These endless payments are a form of slavery. Let's talk a little about the white Irish slave trade. From 1641 to 1652, more than 500,000 Irish were killed by the English and another 300,000 were sold into slavery. Ireland's population fell from 1,500,000 to 600,000 in a single decade. Families were torn apart as the British did not allow Irish dads to take their wives and children with them across the Atlantic. This led to a helpless population of homeless women and children. Britain's solution was to withdraw from the auction as well. During the 1650s, more than 100,000 Irish children between the ages of 10 and 14 were taken from their parents and sold into slavery in the West Indies, Virginia, and New England. In this decade, 52,000 Irish, mostly women and children, were sold to Barbados and Virginia. Another 30,000 Irish men and women were also transported and sold to the highest bidder. In 1656, Cromwell ordered that 2,000 Irish children be taken to Jamaica and sold as slaves. The English colonists. The Irish slave trade began when James II sold 30,000 Irish prisoners as slaves to the New World. His proclamation required 1,625 Irish political prisoners to be sent abroad and sold to English settlers in the West Indies. In the mid-1600s, the Irish were the main slaves sold to Antigua and Montserrat. At that time, 70% of the total population of Montserrat were Irish slaves. Ireland quickly became the largest source of human livestock for English traders. Something you have to know, when talking about slavery in America, most of the first slaves to the New World were actually white. Many people today avoid calling Irish slaves what they really were, slaves. They will come up with terms like servants to describe what happened to the Irish. However, in most cases from the 17th and 18th centuries onwards, Irish slaves were nothing more than human cattle. As an example, the African slave trade was just beginning during this same period. It is well recorded that African slaves, untainted with the stain of hated Catholic theology and more expensive to buy, were often treated much better than their Irish counterparts. Now let's talk a little about a type of voluntary slavery known as debt bondage or indentured servitude. A contract employee or contract labor is an employee, indenture, within a non-free labor system who is bound by a contract, indenture, to work for a particular employer for a fixed period of time. The employer is often allowed to assign labor from an indenture to a third party. Contracts are usually entered into in writing for a specific payment or other benefit or to satisfy a legal obligation, such as debt bondage. Once the contract was completed, the indentured servants were granted freedom or occasionally plots of land. In many countries, contract labor systems have been outlawed. Many Irish came voluntarily, agreeing to provide up to 7 years of work in exchange for passage to the New World and food, housing, and shelter during their indenture. At the end of this period, their masters were legally required to grant them freedom rights in the form of land or capital. Other servants were transported reluctantly, as political prisoners, vagrants, or people who had been defined as undesirables by the state. Until the late 18th century, indentured servitude was very common in British North America. It was often a way for poor Europeans to immigrate to the American colonies. They signed a deed in exchange for a passage. After their contract expired, immigrants were free to work for themselves or another employer. In some cases, the deed was made with the captain of a ship, who an employer in the colonies. Most indentured servants worked as day laborers or domestic servants. Between half and two-thirds of white immigrants to the American colonies between the 1630s and the American Revolution had been under scripture. The International Agreement for the Suppression of the White Slave Trade is a series of anti-trafficking treaties, of which was first negotiated in Paris in 1904. It was one of the first multilateral treaties to address the issues of slavery and human rights human trafficking. The Slavery, Servitude, Forced Labor and Similar Institutions and Practices Convention of 1926 and the Convention for the Suppression of Traffic in Women of Complementary Age of 1933 are similar documents. Ladies and gentlemen, if you like this type of topic, please subscribe to this channel, give it a like, and leave your comments as a way to support this channel.